Okay, so here's what actually happened in the last 48 hours that nobody in Washington saw coming, nobody in the international press predicted, and nobody who has been following this trade war from the beginning genuinely believed was possible at this stage. Trump surrendered. Let me be completely clear about what I mean when I use that word, because I want you to understand that I am not using it loosely or for dramatic effect. I mean that the position the Trump administration has been defending for months, the position that Canada would eventually capitulate, that American economic pressure would eventually become too much for the Canadian government to sustain, that Mark Carney would eventually come to the table on American terms, and that position has been abandoned, not quietly, not through a carefully constructed diplomatic process that gave both sides cover, not in a joint statement full of diplomatic language that let Washington claim it had gotten something in exchange for giving up the fight. The surrender is visible, it is documented, it is on the record. And the most extraordinary thing about it, the thing that is going to define how this moment is remembered and what lessons future leaders draw from it, is that Carney did not ask for it. He did not demand it. He did not negotiate for it. He built his alternatives, held his ground, refused every pressure Washington applied, and waited, and the surrender came anyway. Because that is what happens when you actually have leverage, when you are willing to use it. And when you have a leader who understood from the very beginning that patience and discipline and the willingness to absorb short-term pain are not signs of weakness. They are the most powerful tools available to a country that is prepared to outlast an opponent who cannot sustain his own position. Let me explain exactly what Trump's surrender looks like in concrete, specific terms, because the way the mainstream American media is covering this moment dramatically understates what has actually happened and what it means. The Trump administration has walked back the position it has been publicly defending since the beginning of this trade war on three separate and significant dimensions. First, on the tariff regime, the administration has signaled not through official announcement, but through the market communications and back-channel signals that Washington uses when it wants to change course without admitting it is changing course, that the full tariff regime against Canada is not sustainable, and that a substantial rollback is being prepared, not the partial rollback that Washington tried to offer weeks ago in exchange for Canadian concessions, a substantial rollback that moves the tariff structure significantly closer to the legal requirements of CUSMA. Second, on the legal investigations, the Section 301 unfair trade practice investigations that trade lawyers on both sides of the political spectrum have described as legally indefensible are being quietly shelved. The investigation that was going to take years and cost enormous diplomatic capital before inevitably losing at the WTO is being stood down before it gets to that embarrassing conclusion. Third, and most significantly, on the fundamental framing of the relationship, the characterization of Canada as a trade cheater that has been exploiting the United States, the characterization that Trump used to justify this entire trade war to his political base, is being quietly dropped from official administration communications. These are not minor adjustments at the margins of a policy that remains fundamentally intact. These are the three central pillars of the Trump administration's Canada trade war strategy: the justification, the legal mechanism, and the political framing that have held the entire edifice together. And all three are being abandoned simultaneously, quietly and without the kind of public announcement that would force the administration to defend the reversal. Now, let me tell you about why Carney did not have to ask for this, because that is the most important and most strategically significant aspect of everything that has happened. The conventional wisdom about how trade wars end is that they end through negotiation. One side applies pressure, the other side absorbs it. Eventually, both sides find a face-saving formula that lets them both claim they got something, and the conflict winds down. That is the normal playbook. Carney did not follow the normal playbook. He followed a different playbook entirely, one that was built not around negotiating a resolution, but around making the cost of not resolving the conflict so asymmetrically painful for the United States that Washington would eventually seek resolution on its own, without Carney having to ask for it and without Canada having to give anything up to get it. The way you execute that playbook is exactly what Carney did, with a consistency and a discipline that is genuinely remarkable when you look at the full arc of what he has done since this trade war began. You build alternatives so that your own economy is less dependent on the relationship than the other side assumes. You refuse every pressure tactic so that the other side cannot demonstrate that pressure produces concessions. You make the economic pain visible and attributable. You make sure that American businesses, American consumers, and American politicians understand exactly what the trade war is costing them and exactly who is responsible for those costs. And you wait. You wait with patience and discipline and confidence that the economic and political reality will eventually do the work that negotiation could never do as cleanly. The surrender came not because Carney asked for it, but because the reality of what Trump started made it inevitable. Let me talk about what forced Trump's hand, because the specific mechanisms by which the surrender was produced tell you everything about where the actual leverage in this conflict resided from the very beginning. The first mechanism was the market. American financial markets have been pricing in the costs of the Canada trade war for months, and those costs have been real, visible, and impossible to dismiss. Supply chain disruptions in manufacturing states, lumber price increases that are showing up in housing construction costs from coast to coast, energy cost pressures in the Northeast and Midwest that are hitting consumers in ways they notice and in ways they connect to specific policy decisions. These market costs are not abstractions. They are dollar amounts that appear in quarterly earnings reports, in construction project budgets, in home heating bills. And the businesses bearing those costs have been communicating to Washington through lobbying, through trade association statements, through direct conversations with Republican senators and Republican governors, that the trade war is costing them money and that it needs to stop. The second mechanism was the Republican Party itself. The senators and governors of the states most exposed to Canadian trade disruption, Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Montana, states that voted for Trump and that Republican candidates need to win, have been sending increasingly urgent signals to the White House that the trade war's political sustainability is limited and shrinking. A Republican senator from Michigan does not need to publicly criticize the president by name, does not need to hold press conferences calling for de-escalation, does not need to do anything that would put him in direct conflict with the White House to make clear that the economic disruption in his state is becoming a political problem that has electoral consequences. He just needs to be seen meeting with Canadian trade officials, or to include language in a budget amendment that calls for trade resolution, or to give a speech about the importance of North American supply chains to his state's manufacturing sector, or to simply be conspicuously absent from the list of Republicans who are defending the administration's Canada policy. The signals are being sent through every available channel. The signals are being sent through every available channel. They are being received by a White House that tracks Republican political vulnerability with extraordinary care. And collectively, over months of accumulating pressure from the party's own political base, they produce the result that Carney's strategy was always designed to produce, not through confrontation, not through negotiation, but through the simple and irresistible logic of political self-preservation. I want to address the question of what comes next, because a Trump surrender is not the same as a Trump resolution. And it is important to be clear about the difference. A surrender means that the position has been abandoned. A resolution means that a new, stable, mutually acceptable arrangement has been put in place to replace it. Those two things are related, but they are not the same. And the gap between them is where the next phase of this conflict will play out. What Carney needs from a genuine resolution, the conditions he has stated publicly and consistently throughout this conflict, is the removal of the tariffs that violate CUSMA, the withdrawal of the legally indefensible trade investigations, and an acknowledgement that the violations that were committed need to be corrected rather than papered over with a joint statement that pretends they were a mutual problem. What Trump needs from a resolution is a formula that lets him claim some version of victory to his base, a formula that lets him say that the tough approach worked, that Canada made concessions, that America got something it wanted. The challenge of the next phase is finding an arrangement that meets both of those needs simultaneously. Carney's conditions are not unreasonable. They are essentially just a return to what both countries agreed to when they signed KSMA. But the political framing challenge of presenting a return to the status quo ante as an American victory is significant. It requires creativity, and it requires both sides to have enough goodwill toward the resolution to make the framing work. Whether that goodwill exists is the question. What is clear is that the leverage dynamic has shifted decisively and permanently. Canada is not negotiating from a position of weakness. Canada is negotiating from a position of demonstrated strength, demonstrated patience, and demonstrated willingness to absorb costs that Washington assumed would be unsustainable. The resolution, when it comes, will reflect that reality in every substantive provision, even if the political packaging around it is designed to obscure the fundamental asymmetry of where the two sides stood when the negotiations finally concluded. Let me tell you what this moment means beyond the immediate bilateral dispute. Because the implications of a Trump surrender to Canada extend far beyond the trade relationship between two neighboring countries. Every government in the world that has ever been on the receiving end of American economic coercion is watching this moment and drawing conclusions about what it means and what it makes possible. The conclusion they are drawing is not subtle. It is that American economic pressure, however formidable, can be successfully resisted by a country that has the strategic discipline to build real alternatives, the political leadership to refuse to negotiate under coercion, and the patience to wait for economic and political reality to do the work that direct confrontation cannot. That lesson is going to be studied. It is going to be applied, and it is going to shape how countries around the world respond to American economic pressure in ways that have implications far beyond this particular trade war and far beyond North America. Canada's resistance to American economic dominance was not just a victory for Canada in a bilateral trade dispute. It was a demonstration visible to every government, every market, every country that has ever worried about being on the receiving end of American economic pressure that resistance is possible, that it can succeed, and that the playbook for successful resistance has now been written, proven effective, and documented in enough detail that other countries can study it and apply its lessons to their own situations. If you are Canadian watching this, your Prime Minister built something remarkable. He built a strategy that worked, executed it with discipline that was genuinely impressive, and delivered a result that no previous Canadian government had managed to produce in a confrontation with the United States. He did not ask Trump to surrender. He built the conditions in which surrender was inevitable without requiring a single direct confrontation to produce it. That is a different and fundamentally more durable kind of victory than anything that could have been achieved through conventional negotiation. It is the kind of victory that changes the terms of every future interaction because it establishes permanently that Canada is a country that cannot be bullied, cannot be outlasted, and cannot be coerced into accepting terms it finds unacceptable. If you are American watching this, your government started a trade war. It was not prepared to win against a country it fundamentally underestimated at every turn, using justifications that were false from the first day they were stated, and has now surrendered in ways that leave American credibility weaker, American leverage smaller, and American relationships with its closest allies more damaged than at any point before. Any of this started. The cost will be paid by American workers, American consumers, and American businesses for years to come, not by those who made the decision to start it. July 2026 is coming. Carney already won. He just had to wait.